Welcome to Historian Diary. Today I'm going to tell you a story that sits on the razor's edge between history and legend. A story about a woman who terrified her enemies, commanded armies, and became one of the most fearsome warriors the Vikings ever knew. Her name was Lagertha. But here's the question that historians have been debating for centuries. Did she really exist? Close your eyes and imagine Scandinavia in the 9th century. Longships cutting through icy waters, warriors with axes and shields, and among them a woman whose skill in battle was said to rival any man. This is the story of Lagertha, the shield maiden who may have changed Viking history forever, the Vikings. When we hear that word, we think of bearded warriors sailing across oceans to raid and conquer. But that image is only half the story, because among those warriors there were women. Women who didn't just stay home weaving and cooking. Women who picked up swords and shields. Women who fought. And the most famous of them all was Lagertha. But before we dive into her story, we need to understand where this story comes from, because that's where things get complicated. Our main source for Lagertha's story is a work called Gesta Danorum, The History of the Danes, written by a Danish historian named Saxo Grammaticus around the late 12th or early 13th century. Now immediately you should notice a problem. Saxo was writing in the 1200s about events that supposedly happened in the 800s. That's a gap of about 400 years. Imagine someone today writing about events from the 1600s with no written records, just oral traditions and stories passed down through generations. How accurate would that be? This is the challenge we face with Lagertha. Saxo wasn't there. He was collecting stories, legends, folk tales, and trying to create a coherent history of Denmark. In Saxo's work, Lagertha appears in Book 9 as a skilled warrior, a shield maiden who fought alongside men and earned their respect. According to Saxo, Lagertha's story begins with a Norwegian king named Frø, who invaded Norway and killed the Norwegian king. But Frø didn't stop there. He threw the women of the royal household into a brothel. Among these women was Lagertha, described as being of noble birth. But Lagertha wasn't going to accept this fate. Instead of submitting, she and other women decided to fight back. Enter Ragnar Lodbrok. Yes, that Ragnar, the legendary Viking hero. According to Saxo, Ragnar heard about the injustice and decided to avenge these women. He gathered an army and marched against King Frø. But when the battle began, Ragnar got a surprise. The women weren't waiting to be rescued. They were fighting, and at the front was Lagertha. Saxo writes that Lagertha fought with incredible skill and courage, her hair loose flowing down her back, fighting with such ferocity that even hardened warriors were amazed. She wasn't just participating, she was dominating. Where are you watching from? What time is it in your country? Let me know in the comments. Ragnar noticed Lagertha immediately. After the battle was won and King Frø was defeated, Ragnar was so impressed that he wanted to marry her. But Lagertha wasn't going to make it easy. According to Saxo, she set a test. She placed a bear and a dog outside her house to guard it. If Ragnar truly wanted to marry her, he would have to defeat these beasts first. Ragnar killed both with his bare hands and a spear. They got married, but this wasn't a fairy tale romance. This was a Viking marriage, complicated and often brutal. Ragnar and Lagertha had children together. For a time they seemed happy. Lagertha proved herself, not just as a warrior, but also as a leader. When Ragnar needed help in his wars, Lagertha would show up with ships and warriors. She commanded respect. She led armies. But then the marriage fell apart. Ragnar was ambitious and restless. He left Lagertha and married another woman named Thora. Lagertha was devastated, but she didn't sit around crying. She took action. According to Saxo, Lagertha returned to her homeland in Norway and murdered her new husband with a spearhead she had hidden in her dress. Why? To take sole control of his lands and power. Lagertha wasn't just a warrior. She was a ruthless political operator. But the story doesn't end there. Years later, Ragnar found himself in trouble. He was at war and losing. He needed help. And who did he turn to? Lagertha. Despite everything that had happened, Ragnar sent messengers asking for her help. And she said yes. Lagertha gathered a fleet and sailed to Ragnar's aid. In the battle that followed, her forces played a crucial role in Ragnar's victory. After the victory, Ragnar apparently tried to get back together with Lagertha, but she refused. She had moved on. She had her own kingdom, her own power, her own life. She didn't need Ragnar anymore. Now let's ask the critical question. Is any of this true? Did Lagertha really exist? This is where historians start having arguments. On one side, scholars say Lagertha is completely mythical, a literary creation by Saxo. They point out that there are no contemporary sources mentioning Lagertha, no rune stones with her name, no archaeological evidence directly tied to her. The only source is Saxo, writing hundreds of years after the fact, and his work is full of mythological elements and literary embellishments. Are you enjoying this story? Let me know in the comments. On the other side, scholars argue that while Lagertha's story has been embellished, there might be a kernel of truth. They point to several pieces of evidence. First, we know that shield-maidens existed in Viking society. We have archaeological evidence of women buried with weapons. The most famous example is the Birka warrior grave in Sweden. For decades, this grave was assumed to be a male warrior because it contained a full set of weapons, including a sword, arrows, battle knife, 2 shields, and 2 horses. But in 2017, DNA analysis proved the skeleton was female. This was a woman buried with full military honors. If one woman could be a warrior, why not others? Second, we have literary evidence beyond Saxo. Norse sagas mention shield-maidens repeatedly, Hervor who dressed as a man and became a warrior. Brynhildr, a shield-maiden who was also a Valkyrie. Freydis Eiriksdottir who fought in Vinland while pregnant. These stories suggest that female warriors weren't just acceptable in Viking culture, they were celebrated. Third, the name itself, Lagertha. Some scholars believe this is a Latinized version of a Norse name, possibly Hladgerdr, meaning protector or defender. If Saxo heard stories about a legendary warrior woman and wrote it down as Lagertha, that would make sense. The genuine Norse origin suggests it might not be completely invented. Fourth, Viking society gave women significant rights and freedoms. Women could own property, demand divorces, and manage estates. While it wasn't common for women to be warriors, it wasn't impossible. Vikings valued prowess in battle above almost everything else. If a woman could fight well, she would be respected. In this context, a woman like Lagertha isn't impossible. But even if shield-maidens existed, that doesn't prove Lagertha specifically was real. She could be a composite character, combining elements from multiple women. She could be based on a real person whose story was heavily embellished, or she could be entirely fictional, created to represent an ideal. So what do I think? As a historian, I have to be honest. We cannot say with certainty that Lagertha was a real historical person. The evidence is too thin. We have one source written centuries later, full of legendary material with no corroboration. But we also cannot say with certainty that she didn't exist. Many historical figures, especially women, have been erased from the record. It's entirely possible that a woman like Lagertha existed, fought in battles, led warriors, and was forgotten by history, only to be remembered through oral traditions. What I can tell you is this: whether Lagertha was real or not, the fact that her story was told and remembered tells us something important about Viking society. It tells us that Vikings could imagine women as warriors, as leaders, as heroes. In a culture that valued martial prowess above everything, the highest compliment was to call someone a great warrior, and Vikings were willing to give that compliment to women. That's significant. Let's talk about what we know about women in Viking society. First, Viking women had more rights than women in most other medieval European societies. They could inherit property, own businesses, demand divorces, and manage farms when their men went raiding. Second, women played important religious roles. Many powerful religious practitioners were women, the vulvas who practiced Seder, a form of magic and prophecy. Third, women were respected for being strong, capable, and intelligent. The ideal Viking woman wasn't meek and submissive, she was formidable. Did you know about shield-maidens before this? Write in the comments. In this context, shield-maidens make sense. Not common, but not impossible. They represent an extreme version of the Viking ideal of the strong, capable woman. Whether Lagertha specifically existed or not, she represents something real in Viking culture. The idea that women could be warriors if they had the skill and courage. Let me tell you about archaeological evidence for Viking women warriors. For a long time, archaeologists assumed graves with weapons contained men. But as DNA testing became common, we've started testing those assumptions, and we've found that some warrior men were actually women. The Birka warrior is the most famous, but there are others. Graves in Denmark and Norway have yielded women buried with weapons. We have to be careful interpreting this. Just because a woman was buried with weapons doesn't necessarily mean she was a warrior. Weapons could be symbolic, indicating status rather than combat experience. But some burials are so elaborate, with such complete military equipment, it's hard to explain them away as purely symbolic. The Birka warrior had a complete battle kit, offensive weapons, defensive equipment, tactical game pieces suggesting command responsibility. This wasn't ceremonial. This was a full military burial, so we know at least some Viking women had military roles. How common? We don't know. The number of confirmed female warrior graves is small, so female warriors were definitely not common. But they existed. They were real. And they were buried with honor, suggesting Viking society accepted and respected them. Here's another piece of evidence. We have legal codes from medieval Scandinavia that specifically mention women bearing arms. These laws try to regulate or restrict women's use of weapons, which means it was happening enough that lawmakers felt they needed to address it. You don't make laws against things that never happen. Now let's think about what parts of Lagertha's story might be plausible. A woman fighting to escape slavery? Plausible. Vikings valued personal honor, and women had agency. Ragnar noticing her prowess and wanting to marry her. Plausible. Vikings respected martial skill. Lagertha leading her own forces years later. Also plausible. Women could manage estates and raise troops. Her murdering her second husband? Plausible in that Viking politics were brutal. What about fantastic elements? The bear and dog test feels like folklore. Descriptions of her fighting with supernatural skill, her hair flying like it has a mind of its own. These are literary embellishments. Saxo was writing in Latin, influenced by classical Roman authors, and he frequently used mythological imagery. He wasn't trying to write history in the modern sense. He was trying to create a grand epic narrative. So here's my conclusion. She probably wasn't real as described by Saxo. The Lagertha in Saxo's text is too much of a literary construct, too full of mythological elements. But she might be based on real women, possibly multiple women whose stories were combined. Or she might represent an ideal that existed in Viking culture. In either case, her story tells us something true, that Vikings valued strength regardless of gender, that they could imagine women as warriors and leaders, and that some women actually filled those roles. Even if rarely, the legacy of Lagertha lives on. She appears in modern novels, TV shows, video games, and comics. Many of you probably discovered her through the TV show Vikings. The show took Saxo's basic outline and expanded it into a full, complex character. But we need to be clear, the TV show is not history. It's historical fiction that treats history as a jumping-off point. The real Lagertha, if she existed, might have been very different. Lagertha, real or legendary, has become a symbol of female strength, of women who refuse to be limited by expectations. She's been embraced by feminists, by Viking enthusiasts, by people who love stories about strong women. And there's value in that, even if we can't prove she was real. Symbols matter, stories matter. The fact that people in the Middle Ages told stories about warrior women, and people today still find them inspiring, tells us something important about human nature and our ongoing struggle with gender roles. In the end, the question, was Lagertha real, might be the wrong question. The better question is, what does her story tell us? It tells us that across centuries and cultures, people have always been drawn to stories about women who break the rules, who exceed expectations, who refuse to be limited. It tells us that the desire for gender equality and recognition of women's strength is not new. It's ancient. And it tells us that sometimes a legend can be as important as a fact, because legends shape how we see the world and ourselves. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the mystery of Lagertha. If you enjoyed this exploration of Viking history and legend, please like this video and subscribe to Historian Diary. We explore fascinating historical figures and ask the hard questions about what we really know. What other legendary figures would you like me to investigate? Let me know in the comments. And one last question. Does it matter to you whether Lagertha was real? Or is the legend enough? Think about it and let me know. Until next time, keep exploring history with me.